It was a quiet summer night in the English countryside, August 8, 1963. A mail train left Glasgow, heading south to London. Inside were bags of cash, securities, and registered mail over £2.6 million in total, the equivalent of more than £60 million today. But the train never made it to its destination. Because waiting for it, in the shadows of a small bridge in Buckinghamshire, was a gang of 15 men, ready to commit one of the most audacious robberies in British history. The Great Train Robbery wasn't just a crime of greed. It was a story of precision, betrayal, and a desperate attempt to outsmart an entire nation. And for a time they did. The train they targeted was called the Up Special. It was a Royal Mail train that traveled every night from Glasgow to London, carrying millions in cash from banks and post offices across Scotland. Normally, the train was heavily guarded by postal workers, but had no police escort. Its route was predictable, its timing consistent, the perfect setup for a heist. Among the 12 carriages, one was special, the high-value package coach, where the money was sorted and stored under lock and key. The robbers had studied this train for months. They knew its exact route, its speed, and even the crew rotations. They weren't petty thieves. They were organized, disciplined, and led by a man who understood planning down to the minute. His name was Bruce Reynolds. Reynolds was a suave, well-dressed career criminal with a taste for jazz and fine living. He saw the Great Train Robbery not as a crime, but as a masterpiece. To him, it was about making history, pulling off something no one thought possible. And he wasn't alone. He assembled a crew of experienced men, drivers, safecrackers, electricians, and enforcers. Among them were Garden Goody, Charlie Wilson, and the notorious Ronald Buster Edwards, each with their own reputation in London's criminal underworld. But perhaps the most mysterious figure was the one known only as the Ulsterman, an insider who provided critical details about the train's schedule and the massive cash haul it was carrying that night. In the early hours of August 8, 1963, the gang was already in place near a small bridge called Bridego Bridge, just outside the village of Ledburn. At 3 a.m., they waited in the dark, dressed in military-style clothes, their faces hidden by scarves. The plan was simple in theory, but dangerous in execution. They had tampered with the railway signals, setting the green light to red, forcing the train to stop. When the train driver, Jack Mills, saw the red light ahead, he slowed to a halt, assuming there was trouble on the line. Moments later, a figure stepped from the shadows. Mills had no idea he was driving straight into an ambush. As the train ground to a stop, several men boarded the engine. Jack Mills and his second man, David Whitby, were overpowered. Mills resisted, but one of the robbers struck him with an iron bar, knocking him unconscious. Meanwhile, other members of the gang uncoupled the first two carriages, the engine and the high-value mail car, and drove them half a mile down the track, away from the rest of the train. Inside the mail car, postal workers sat stunned as masked men burst through the doors, barking orders. In less than 30 minutes, the robbers had taken control. Then came the real challenge, getting the money out. The cash was stored in 120 mail bags, each heavy with used banknotes. Working like a military unit, the robbers formed a chain, loading bag after bag into waiting trucks parked under the bridge. By 3:30 a.m., it was done. Over £2.6 million, the largest cash haul in British history, gone without a single shot fired. As dawn approached, the robbers vanished into the countryside, leaving the wounded train driver behind. The police arrived soon after the alarm was raised. What they found stunned them: the train stripped, the money gone, and no sign of the robbers. This was no ordinary heist. It was coordinated, efficient, and executed with military precision. But the robbers had made one critical decision, a choice that would ultimately lead to their downfall. They didn't flee immediately. Instead, they retreated to a rented farmhouse called Leatherslade Farm, just 25 miles away. The plan was to lie low for a few days until the nationwide search cooled off. At the farm, they divided the money, each man taking roughly £150,000. They burned their gloves and cleaned their vehicles. Everything was going according to plan, but as the police pressure mounted, panic began to set in. Reynolds' plan depended on secrecy, yet some members couldn't resist bragging. Others brought outsiders to the farm, breaking the gang's golden rule: no visitors, ever. By the end of the week, fear had taken over. The men scattered, abandoning Leatherslade Farm, but they left behind fingerprints, documents, and supplies, crucial evidence that would become the foundation of one of the biggest police investigations in British history. Scotland Yard launched Operation Countryman, mobilizing hundreds of officers. They combed through the countryside, interviewing locals, and tracking down every known associate of Bruce Reynolds and his crew. The press called it the crime of the century. For weeks, the front pages of British newspapers were dominated by one story: who stole the train money? Within days, police discovered Leatherslade Farm. Inside were beds, dishes, empty beer bottles, and dozens of fingerprints. It was a goldmine of forensic evidence. Detectives began linking the prints to known criminals. By mid-August, arrests began. One by one, the key members were caught. Garden Goody, Charlie Wilson, Roy James, and Buster Edwards, all rounded up within months. But not all. Bruce Reynolds, the mastermind, managed to slip away. For years, he remained on the run, traveling through Mexico and Canada under fake identities, living off the stolen cash. Another figure, Ronnie Biggs, would also become infamous, not just for the crime, but for what came next. Ronnie Biggs was a small-time crook who played a minor role in the robbery. But after being caught and sentenced to 30 years in prison, he pulled off a daring escape. In 1965, Biggs climbed over the wall of Wandsworth Prison using a rope ladder and vanished. His escape captured the imagination of the public. While most saw him as a criminal, others viewed him as a folk hero, a man who had beaten the system. Biggs fled to France, then to Australia, and finally settled in Brazil, where he lived for decades, taunting British authorities who could never bring him back. His face appeared in newspapers, magazines, and documentaries. He even recorded a song with the Sex Pistols in the 1970s. It was a bizarre twist. The man who once helped rob a train was now a celebrity. But behind the headlines and the legend, there was real suffering. Train driver Jack Mills never fully recovered from the attack. He returned to work but suffered from severe headaches and emotional trauma. He died just a few years later, in 1970, never seeing justice served for the assault that nearly killed him. The human cost of the Great Train Robbery is often overshadowed by its glamour, the daring escape, the hidden cash, the idea of the gentleman thief. But for the victims, it was a nightmare that lasted long after the robbers vanished. In 1964, the trial of the Great Train robbers began at Aylesbury Assizes. It was one of the longest and most expensive trials in British legal history. 12 of the men were convicted and handed down record sentences, 30 years each. The judge called it a crime of the utmost gravity. But even behind bars, the story refused to die. 2 years later, Charlie Wilson, one of the ringleaders, escaped from prison with the help of outside accomplices. He fled to Canada but was eventually recaptured. For the next decade, myths and rumors swirled. Where was the missing money? How much did each man actually keep? And who was the Ulsterman, the mysterious insider who fed them information? Even today, those questions remain unanswered. Some claim the Ulsterman was a corrupt postal worker. Others believe he was a former train employee who knew the route intimately. Despite endless speculation, his true identity has never been confirmed. And as for the money, most of it was never recovered. Police managed to seize only a fraction of the £2.6 million. The rest vanished, hidden, laundered, or spent during the gang's years in hiding. Bruce Reynolds was finally caught in 1968 in Torquay, Devon, after 5 years on the run. He served 10 years in prison and later wrote a memoir, reflecting on the heist that defined his life. He described the robbery as a moment of glory followed by a lifetime of regret. Over the years, the Great Train Robbery became more than a crime. It became a cultural phenomenon. Movies, books, and songs celebrated it as a symbol of rebellion against authority. But the truth is darker. It was a brutal crime, one that left scars on everyone involved. Families torn apart, lives destroyed, and men who spent decades behind bars for a few hours of glory. And yet, there's still something hauntingly fascinating about it. Maybe it's the precision. Maybe it's the mystery of the missing money. Or maybe it's the idea that for one night in 1963, 15 men outsmarted the entire British establishment and got away with it. In later years, as the robbers grew old, many spoke about the heist with a strange mix of pride and regret. Ronnie Biggs eventually returned to Britain voluntarily in 2001, old and frail, saying he wanted to die a free man. He was rearrested, served his remaining sentence, and released on compassionate grounds in 2009. When he died in 2013, headlines once again resurrected the legend of the Great Train Robbery. But behind the legend lies a sobering truth. No one truly won. The robbers lost their freedom, their families, and their peace of mind. The victims lost their safety and health. And the country lost a sense of innocence, the belief that its institutions were untouchable. More than 6 decades later, the Great Train Robbery still captures the imagination. It was, in many ways, a turning point, a moment when crime became spectacle, when villains became celebrities. But when the lights fade and the myth is stripped away, what remains is a story about human ambition, the desire to take everything, no matter the cost. As Bruce Reynolds once said, it wasn't about the money, it was about the risk, the danger, the feeling of beating the odds. Perhaps that's the most dangerous part of all. Because in the end, the Great Train Robbery wasn't just a story about 15 men and a stolen fortune. It was a story about how far people will go to chase a dream, even when that dream can destroy them. And as the train disappeared into the night that summer in 1963, it carried with it more than just money. It carried a piece of British history, one that still refuses to fade. Would you have done it? If you knew there was £2.6 million sitting in the dark, waiting, would you have stopped that train? Or would you have let it pass, knowing that every fortune, no matter how great, always comes with a price? Because in the end, the Great Train Robbery reminds us that sometimes the greatest escape isn't from the law, but from ourselves. This is Crimes Unknown, where cold cases refuse to stay buried. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more haunting mysteries. And don't forget to like the video to support real crime stories that deserve to be heard. Drop your theories in the comments.